Dismissed from a wealthy household for theft, the caretaker reluctantly trudged along the road. When she overheard the conversation between two foreigners, Karen was leaving the Baldwin family's house with a heavy heart. Tears were welling up in her eyes, and her hands were trembling slightly from the emotional shock. "You're a thief. I don't want to see your face here again," shouted Jenny, Scott Baldwin's wife, as she followed Karen. Karen shook her head and bit her lip until it hurt. What could she say? The customer is always right. They were wealthy, and she was just an ordinary caretaker with some skills and patient care. And where could that bracelet have gone? Karen had never even seen it, let alone touched it, since it was kept in a box in the homeowner's closet, and she was not allowed into that room. Sighing sadly, Karen quickened her pace. She had to walk along the railway tracks. The Baldwin family's house was located outside the city, and getting there without personal transportation was quite difficult. Previously, Lester, the homeowner's son, had driven her, but after the scandal over the missing family jewel, that was out of the question. The head of the family, Scott, was generally on Karen's side, but on that fateful day, he was too weak to defend his caretaker. Jenny, on the other hand, made a big fuss, blowing the scandal out of proportion. Trying to push away her gloomy thoughts, Karen focused on the road stretching ahead like a steel ribbon. It was getting dark, and there was still a long way to go to the city. Suddenly, about 50 meters ahead, Karen saw the outline of a large vehicle parked near the railway tracks. But there was no crossing here. Why had the driver stopped? It seemed strange. Karen grew anxious. Maybe it's better to go around through the forest? No, that's not a great idea. It's better to go straight. Whatever happens, happens. If necessary, I have a deodorant spray in my bag. Not pepper spray, of course, but still. Meanwhile, two tall, fit men dressed in dark suits, almost like shadows in the twilight, got out of the car. They began to discuss some problem out loud, gesticulating actively. Karen had never been curious, but their voices sounded odd. What was strange about them? At first, she didn't understand what the issue was. But when she listened closely, she realized they were speaking a foreign language. Karen had never considered herself a polyglot, but this language was familiar from her school days. "Well, where are we supposed to look for him now?" asked one of the foreigners gloomily. "How should I know? Are we supposed to comb through the entire forest?" "We'll be at it until morning, and it's far from certain that we'll find anything," the second one replied. Karen flinched. What were they talking about? Were they looking for someone? Turning her head at the sound of her footsteps, the strangers in black grew noticeably wary, but the girl walked past as if it were just another day and another routine. "Look at that." "Who would call her smart?" one of the foreigners sneered, thinking that Karen didn't understand. "Yeah, quite a sight." "Probably some dairy worker," the second one agreed. Karen clenched the deodorant spray in her fingers until they ached and walked past. She had just moved about 50 meters away when she heard the sound of an approaching train behind her. Shivering, Karen moved to the side. At that moment, she saw a small silhouette darting through the bushes. Then came a barely audible crunch of branches, making her flinch. Glancing back involuntarily, Karen noticed the foreigners following her. Her heart raced. At that instant, she saw an 8-year-old boy watching her with frightened, tearful eyes from the bushes. The voices of the foreigners were already audible behind her. She made a decision almost immediately. Pressing her index finger to her lips, Karen took the boy's hand. "Come with me, quickly," she commanded, and hurriedly crossed the road, knowing that the passing train would cut them off from their pursuers. The strangers shouted excitedly but could do nothing now. Karen and the boy had already plunged into the forest, with the long train effectively shielding them from the foreigners. They ran, navigating through bushes, thickets, and over piles of dry branches. Finally, Karen stopped to catch her breath. After all, she hadn't run like this since her school days. "Listen, kid, why are they looking for you?" Karen asked, struggling to regain her breath. The boy looked at his savior with sadness. "I don't know. They came to the orphanage, said they were my parents, and took me away, but I didn't like how they behaved. I asked them to stop, to go to the bathroom, and then I ran into the forest. Karen looked at the little one with sympathy, an orphan who had ended up in such a terrible situation. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Robert." "And yours?" "Karen," the girl replied with a smile. "That's all well and good, but we need to get out of here as soon as possible." "Yes, but I don't know where to go. I can't go back to the orphanage. And I don't want to meet those men again," Robert sniffled. Karen thought for a moment. She generally knew which direction the city was. Looking at the terrified boy, she sighed. "Let's go, Robert," Karen said softly. "I know how to get out. We'll find a place in the city where you'll get help." The boy nodded uncertainly. His eyes continued to search the forest for any hint of safety from the encroaching darkness. As she led him along, Karen considered her options for where they could find help. The police? Unlikely. The orphanage was not an option either. So where? Home? But Louis and his friends would probably be there again, her half-brother from her father's side, who was not easy to get rid of. He had been released a month ago and had come to stay with his sister, asking for shelter. He refused to work and it wasn't easy to throw him out. While Andrew was in prison, Karen's father had died but had left her his apartment in his will. Louis didn't like that. Their mother had long since distanced herself from him and, according to rumors, had already found a new partner. Louis had blamed Karen, claiming that she was the root of all problems. He had found a scapegoat. So where to go now? To her former suitor Ben? That wasn't an option. He had long since found the one he had been searching for, a wealthy fiancée and the daughter of a banker. Suddenly, a name came to mind, Anna, the owner of a small, cozy cafe on the outskirts of the city. She had once been a singing teacher, and Karen had taken lessons from her for a while. Later, Anna sold some inherited property from her late husband and opened the cafe. Karen remembered how Anna had helped her find a job with the Baldwin family. Anna always had a kind heart and an open soul. "Robert," Karen said more confidently, "let's go. I know where we need to go." Robert, now more lively, looked into her eyes with interest. He understood that this kind lady clearly wouldn't abandon him in trouble. At that moment, Karen remembered herself at his age, when life was also full of hardships and uncertainties. But back then, her concerns were only about school grades and misunderstandings with her parents, not threats of being abducted by a pair of foreigners with an unclear agenda. Karen looked around, the dense thicket surrounded them, and time was pressing. The train had long gone, and the two who had been pursuing them might return. Karen knew she couldn't delay. The path was difficult, darkness concealed the trail, and tree branches snagged on the travelers' clothes, causing them to stumble. Though small, Robert walked quite briskly, constantly trying to uplift her with his optimism. "Karen, do you know any fairy tales?" he suddenly asked, breaking the silence. "The caregivers sometimes read them to our whole group at bedtime." Karen smiled. "Of course, I do," she said. "But maybe you've already heard this one?" "Still, please tell it," Robert quietly requested. Karen took a deep breath and began softly narrating a fairy tale about a prince and a dragon. The boy listened silently, not interrupting. They walked for quite a while until they finally emerged from the forested area. Before them lay the city, illuminated by streetlights. Karen smiled as she recognized the familiar streets. She no longer felt fear, only joy at having been able to help the child. "Robert," she finally said, "we're going to visit a friend of mine now. It will be safe there. Don't worry, everything will be fine." The boy, still shaken, nodded and grasped her hand more tightly. "Karen, can I thank you for everything?" he asked, looking at her with unhidden gratitude in his eyes. "Of course, Robert," Karen smiled. "And now, let's go. Anna will make us hot tea and give us something delicious to eat. Look, there's the cafe. Do you see it?" Karen waved toward the tiny establishment hidden among the tall trees. Warm light streamed through the windows, cozily illuminating the interior. Above the entrance hung a sign that read Anna's. Robert, like a little sparrow, snuggled up to Karen, watching the scene with the wary caution typical of all orphans. He didn't quite understand what a cafe was, but he sensed that he was expected in this small, bright place. "Let's go," Karen whispered. "Anna is very kind, she will help us." The cafe greeted them with the scent of cinnamon and strong coffee. As Karen and Robert stepped inside, the aroma of freshly baked bread hit their noses. Behind the counter, covered with a red tablecloth, stood the bartender and cook in one, Craig. He was tall, with a thick gray beard and friendly eyes. Seeing Karen, he broke into a wide smile. "Karen, my dear, it's so good to see you. And who is this with you?" "This is Robert, he's in trouble and needs help," Karen explained. Craig patted the little boy on the head. "Don't be afraid, you'll be safe here." Meanwhile, Karen took a seat at a table by the window. At that moment, a waitress with a name badge, Tammy, approached them. She was slender, with freckles and cheerful blue eyes. Tammy poured hot raspberry tea for Robert and brought a cup of strong coffee for Karen. Karen thanked Craig and Tammy warmly for their help and care. As Robert drank his tea, he began to relax a bit, and a few minutes later, to his great surprise, he saw sandwiches with bacon and cheese, pieces of fresh bread, and a bowl of cherries on the table. "These are for you, little guy," Tammy said with a smile. "Eat up, we have good food here." Robert frowned when he saw that one of the sandwiches had cheese. He didn't like cheese. "Can I have the one with meat?" he asked. "Of course," Karen replied, tickling him under the chin. "Eat whatever you like." At that moment, a tall man in a leather jacket burst into the cafe. He had dark hair, a small beard, and piercing blue eyes. "Hey, folks," he shouted, passing by Karen and Robert's table. "Craig, got anything stronger than tea? I'm beat from the road." "Sure, Mark. I'll pour you something," Craig answered. "Been on the road a lot today?" "Yeah, I stopped by my old friends in town, checked how they're doing. Everything's fine. But I've got a problem, my motorcycle broke down on the road." "Is the engine acting up again?" Craig asked with a smile. "What's wrong with it?" "Well, as soon as I left town, it stalled. I checked the wires, put in new spark plugs, and it still won't start." "Well, Mark, you really don't know how to handle machinery," Tammy teased with a laugh. "I might not be great with mechanics, but I take care of my bike with all my heart," he replied. Craig smiled. "All right, Mark, go get some rest. I'll take a look at your engine later, maybe I can bring it back to life. You know, I used to be the garage manager at a taxi service. Engines are my thing. Cooking is just a hobby, something I do for pleasure." Mark nodded and went outside. Robert, who had been watching him, immediately noticed a tattoo on his arm. It depicted something strange and incomprehensible. "Karen, is that man a pirate?" he asked in a whisper. "No, that's Mark," Tammy said as she approached with a tray. "They say he used to be a police officer but retired after being injured. Now he's a biker." "What's a biker?" Robert asked. "A biker is someone who rides a motorcycle," Karen explained with a smile. "He loves freedom and traveling." "Wow. Is he nice?" Robert asked. "Don't be afraid. Mark is very kind. He might look scary at first, but he's not," Karen reassured him. Robert nodded and thought for a moment. Just then, the cafe door opened, and Anna, the owner of this cozy place, walked in. She was small, like a bird, with curly red hair that framed her face gently and kind gray eyes. Ignoring the other customers, she rushed over to Karen and gave her a big hug. "Karen, my dear," Anna exclaimed, showering her cheeks with kisses. "I'm so happy to see you." Karen, blushing from the surprise, smiled shyly. "Anna, hello. Where would I be without you? Let me introduce you to my new friend. This is Robert." Robert, a little startled by the sudden attention, gave a shy smile. Anna knelt down to be at his eye level and extended her hand. "Hello. What are you doing here?" she asked playfully. The boy hesitated. "I need help," he said quietly, looking down. "I need to hide." "Hide? From whom?" Anna asked, growing concerned. "From the men. They took me from the orphanage and said my parents live abroad," Robert explained. The cafe owner looked at the boy, trying to understand the situation. She felt a deep sympathy for the frightened child, so Anna decided not to ask any more questions for now and just to try and comfort him. "Don't worry, we'll help you. You can stay here with us until we know everything will be all right," she said, gently stroking his head. "Thank you," Robert said sincerely. "Well, then everything's all right," Anna said. "Karen, you know this cafe always opens its doors to anyone in need. Just let me know what needs to be done, and I'm ready to help." "Thank you, I'm very grateful," Karen replied. "I want to talk to you. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but the situation is very complicated. Robert really needs help." "Of course," Anna smiled. "I'll settle Robert in my office now. By the way, Karen, if you'd like, you can stay too. There's a spot in the storeroom. It used to be where the night watchman lived, but it will be better for Robert. There's a new couch, a TV, and even an aquarium with fish." "Wow! Real fish?" the boy exclaimed. Anna looked at her little guest with affection and, extending her hand, led him away. She was gone for about 10 minutes before returning to sit at the table with Karen. "Karen, we've known each other for a long time. Don't be shy. What happened?" Karen sighed and told Anna about the recent events that had led her to take Robert under her protection. She didn't forget to mention the case of the missing bracelet at the Scott Baldwin house, where she had been caring for the family for about a month. The cafe owner listened silently, deep in thought. After hearing the disjointed story, she said, "Well, you've really found yourself in a mess. But don't worry, we'll think of something. You know, your brother Louis came by today. He was nothing like himself, dressed like a bum, eyes red, clearly he'd been drinking. He asked if I had any money, and then suddenly started bragging about selling your apartment. He said it should have gone to him as an inheritance since he's the only relative." "What?" Karen exclaimed. "That's my home. It came to me from my father." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that he wouldn't succeed and that you would definitely fight for your property. But Louis just smirked and said that everything was already decided," Anna said with concern. Karen looked noticeably disheartened. "Karen," Anna began, taking her hand, "don't despair, we'll sort it out. I won't let him rob you. It's not fair, you have a right to your property." Karen shook her head in resignation, involuntarily recalling the incident at the Baldwin house, where she was accused of stealing a family bracelet. She remembered how a month ago, after a phone call, Anna had shown up at their mansion. Back then, she didn't know that life would change so drastically. The mansion was luxurious, as if from the pages of a glossy magazine. The front door boasted a shiny brass handle, and sculptural lions stood on either side, guarding the residents' peace. Karen met Jenny, a woman with an unfriendly look and flashy appearance. Jenny had examined her from head to toe and asked, "Do you really have experience working with sick people?" "Yes, I have experience working in a charity house and providing home care for private individuals," Karen replied. "All right, I'll show you Mr. Scott's room," Jenny said. "He has limited mobility and requires constant care." Jenny opened the door to a spacious room furnished with exquisite furniture. Paintings by famous artists adorned the walls, and in a corner stood a rocking chair where Scott was seated. He was a tall, slender man with gray hair and a look of sadness in his eyes. "Meet my dear," Jenny introduced her. "This is Karen, your new caregiver. She will take care of you and, when possible, help me with household chores." "Hello, Mr. Baldwin. I'm very pleased to meet you," Karen said with a smile. "Hello, nice to meet you," Scott replied, returning the smile. He looked at her with genuine warmth, and in his eyes, Karen saw compassion and a hope for assistance. Scott had become disabled about 5 years ago due to an accident that left him unable to walk and partially lost his sight. His life was confined within the walls of his home, making him very dependent on his young wife and caregiver. Initially, Karen cared for him on a part-time basis, 3 times a week. But when Jenny expressed her dissatisfaction with this arrangement, Karen had to move into the Baldwin house to provide round-the-clock care for Scott. At first, Scott was harsh with her, displeased with the change. He, like his wife, thought that such a young girl couldn't possibly care for him properly. However, Karen proved to be very diligent and patient. Being unable to walk, the businessman suffered from loneliness, while his wife usually immersed herself in her own concerns, forgetting about her husband. During this time, Karen became not just a caregiver but also a friend to Scott. He spoke about his late father, who was a general, his childhood, and his somewhat late love for Jenny, who became his second wife. Karen listened attentively, feeling sympathy for this once strong and now intelligent man. Overall, she was satisfied with the arrangement. But things took a turn for the worse when Scott's adopted son, Lester, returned from vacation 2 weeks later. Unlike his strict mother, Lester Baldwin was a socialite, always in a hurry. Upon his return, he immediately noticed the new caregiver. The businessman's son quickly found reasons to get closer to her. At first, it was simple comments thrown in casually. "Karen, could you make me a stronger cup of tea? Do you get along well with my mother or? And do you have a fiancé?" Karen was cautious. She sensed that something more was behind his feigned concern. Lester was a spoiled rich kid who was unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Karen tried to politely refuse the privileged young man, but Lester was relentless. She began to avoid him as much as possible, but he would come up with the most absurd excuses to see her. He gave compliments, presented expensive flowers, and declared his love. But all of it seemed so insincere that Karen refused to believe him. One day, in his desperation for reciprocation, Lester tried to force himself on her. It happened in his room. He locked the door, trapping Karen inside. But she didn't give in. She screamed, fought back, and eventually managed to defend herself. Lester, stunned by her resistance, had to retreat, nursing his wounds. As a parting shot, he said with a threat, "I'll make you pay for this," Lester had threatened. During those days, Karen felt safe only when she was around Scott. Though he was weak, his kindness and wisdom provided comfort. Soon, Karen began spending even more time with him, reading books aloud and sharing stories about her life. However, life in the Baldwin household was difficult, and she understood this better than anyone else. Jenny Baldwin seized every opportunity to demonstrate who was in charge, or rather, who was the boss. She constantly nitpicked, made comments, and forced Karen to take on extra tasks not mentioned in her job description. Karen endured, trying to remain composed, but beneath her quiet demeanor lay pain from the injustice she faced. One day, Jenny claimed that a valuable family heirloom, the family bracelet stored in a jewelry box, was missing. Naturally, she immediately accused Karen. Yet, the young caregiver had no idea about the existence of this piece of jewelry. "I didn't take anything," Karen defended herself, but no one was willing to listen. In the end, Jenny even declared that she would call the police. Karen begged her to wait, but the housekeeper was adamant. Suppressing a disdainful smirk, she ordered Karen to pack her things and leave. Lester stood aside, making it clear with his presence that his intervention had not been without effect. That very evening, Karen was fired and thrown out of the house like a discarded item. Her life shattered in an instant. Surrounded on all sides, Louis was at home drinking and partying with his friends. She had nowhere to go. Karen was pulled out of her gloomy thoughts by Anna's voice. "I was thinking, let me call Mark. He can help." Karen looked at her former teacher with doubt. "Mark is a good friend of mine," Anna said, already heading to the door. "He worked in the police, but then he was injured. Criminals hijacked an armored truck. There was a chase. Mark's vehicle exploded, and he was severely injured by shrapnel." They couldn't remove one piece that's lodged near his heart. The doctors were afraid to risk it, fearing the responsibility. With that, Anna went out into the yard and, seeing Mark working on his motorcycle, called out, "Mark, come inside, please." Mark carefully emerged from under the motorcycle, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked up. "What's up, Anna?" he asked with a slight smile. "Mark, I need a favor. I know you have many useful connections and police experience. I need you to help this young woman," Anna said, pointing to Karen, who had come into the yard and approached them cautiously. "She has problems with a stepbrother who tried to rob her, among other things." Mark squinted at Karen and nodded slightly. "Well then, tell me what happened." Karen didn't know where to start and spent a few seconds just looking at him, trying to gather her thoughts. "Don't be afraid, I don't bite," Mark smiled, noticing her tension. "Come on, just tell me. I'm not a mind reader." Taking a deep breath, Karen began to recount all her troubles. Mark listened attentively, interrupting only occasionally to furrow his brow or nod in agreement with her story. "Yes, I understand," Mark said when Karen finally finished. "It's an unpleasant situation. But don't panic, we'll come up with something. First, we need to gather evidence. In your case, every little detail matters. I know a few people who can help with that. And secondly, we should talk to your brother and try to resolve things amicably. Although, judging by what you've said, he sounds like a pretty aggressive and selfish type." "Yes," Karen sighed sadly. "Louis has always been like that, wanting to keep everything for himself and never wanting to share. He just forgot that we're siblings and should help each other." "Yeah, that's a problem," Mark nodded. "He's forgotten family values, and it's hard to change people like that." "But I don't want to lose the home that belonged to my father," Karen said. "It's all I have, especially since my father specifically bequeathed it to me." "I'll do my best," Mark said with a smile. "Don't worry, I already have a few ideas." "Well, that's settled then," Anna said. "I'll go take care of things for now, the cafe is closing soon." "Great," Mark concluded. "I'll head to the police with my contacts now." "And Karen, you should rest," Anna said. "Okay," Karen replied. "If you need me, you can find me here, at Anna's cafe. And thank you for your help." Mark headed to his motorcycle, and Karen stood watching him leave. She felt a bit lost, but at the same time filled with a glimmer of hope, as Mark seemed like someone she could trust with her troubles, and maybe he really could help. Mark finally started his motorcycle, gave a parting wave, and rode off in an unknown direction. He knew that a lot of work awaited him, work that he hadn't done in years, what they called field operations. The evening air was thick with the smell of gasoline and exhaust fumes. Mark Parker sped along on his iron horse, feeling the vibrations of the engine coursing through his body, making his blood race through his veins. The motorcycle, once a symbol of his freedom, now served as a comfort, like an old friend. His thoughts were occupied with Karen. The story seemed vaguely familiar to him, the plight of an innocent victim and the cold cruelty of another. As Mark drove through the familiar streets of his hometown, he reminisced about his life before tragedy struck, when he was happy with Katie. They met at a dance in the cultural center, where he played guitar in a rock band composed of volunteers from the city's police and fire departments. Katie was a beauty with large eyes and a striking, memorable smile. Mark fell in love at first sight, and Katie fell in love with him. The young couple was incredibly happy together. Their wedding felt like a fairy tale. All of Mark's friends and colleagues were there, and the evening was filled with joy and unrestrained merriment. Of course, there was a fight, a more playful one with no lasting consequences, just to honor tradition. After the wedding, Katie and Mark lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, which seemed perfect for them. But life turned out to be much more treacherous. Mark worked in the organized crime unit, a dangerous job, but one he loved with all his heart. He always wanted to protect people from crime to make the world a little better. Unfortunately, luck turned its back on him. During one operation to apprehend bank robbers, everything went according to plan until the criminals suddenly opened fire. Mark was shot in the chest, and then there was an explosion, with a shard lodging near his heart. His comrades, seeing him bleeding, managed to get him to the hospital. The operation was successful overall, but the doctors warned that Mark would now live with the shard near his heart for the rest of his life, and he needed to take care of himself and lead a calm life. Katie was in despair, terrified for her husband. He did his best to calm her, telling her everything would be fine, that he would manage, and that he loved her and would never leave her. After his discharge, Mark had to leave the police force, as he was prohibited from carrying a weapon and working in law enforcement. He felt useless. He could no longer protect people or fight crime. This led to a prolonged depression, which ultimately resulted in Katie leaving him. Katie could not accept his new way of life. She didn't want to live with Mark in constant fear and uncertainty. How much time did he have left? A year? 2? When would the shard finally find its way to his heart and end his life, making her a widow? No, Katie didn't want that fate for herself. Mark was left alone. Meanwhile, Katie had started a new life, marrying another, a wealthy and successful businessman. Mark found out about this by accident. He saw them walking down the street. Katie was arm in arm with a young man whose fingers were adorned with massive gold rings. They were laughing and seemed happy. At that moment, Mark realized he had lost love forever. For a while, he even left his hometown, not wanting to see her or the places where they had been happy. After some reflection, the former policeman moved to the coast. He bought a ticket for the first available flight and went off into the unknown. He spent several months by the sea, walking on the beach, looking at the waves, and listening to the sound of the surf. In the sea, Mark saw his reflection and knew that something needed to change in his life because he couldn't continue living like this. After somewhat healing his soul, Mark returned to his hometown as a completely different person. He bought a used motorcycle, a leather jacket, pants, and boots. It was only when he became a biker that he realized freedom was the most important thing to him. Without flaunting his past, Mark became a private detective. However, he was prohibited from carrying a weapon, which he had to accept. But the pain of losing Katie remained with him forever and had not diminished. Mark knew he would never find such love again. As the young biker passed by the house where they once lived together, a sharp pang struck his chest. He saw lights in the windows. Now it was a different family living there. He twisted the throttle and drove on. The motorcycle rumbled deeply, and the evening city sped by. The oncoming wind blew against his face, and Mark felt weightless, like the ghost rider racing on his bike for centuries. At that moment, he knew he was ready to protect Karen no matter what. Whatever happens, let the shard take its course. Maybe he still had time to do something good with his life. Meanwhile, after her conversation with Mark and Anna, Karen went to sleep in the storage room, as suggested. There was a fairly decent couch there, covered with a clean blanket. The blanket, soft and warm, only gave the illusion of peace. Karen tossed from side to side, trying to find a comfortable position, but sleep would not come. Her mind was tangled with thoughts and images from the past. Her gaze inadvertently drifted to the dim light of a street lamp filtering through the curtain. Memory took her back, school years, carefree days, infatuation. There was Fred, the handsome son of Anna, carrying Karen's backpack, tall, with freckles on his nose and bright eyes like a cat's. Their secret meetings under the old birch tree, whispers, laughter, and first kisses. She remembered how Fred clumsily held her hand, how he blushed when Karen spoke about feelings, how he gave her wildflowers, and how he once shyly said she was the prettiest girl in school. But all of that passed away like a meteorite fragment disappearing into the atmosphere. A tragic accident, an absurd death. Fred drowned while swimming in the river. Karen remembered all too well the pain of that loss, Anna's tears, the hopeless emptiness in her eyes, the coffin covered forever in black velvet, and the endless chasm of grief into which the mourning mother fell. Many years had passed since then, but Karen still felt that unbearable pain. Anna could never forgive herself for losing her son, blaming herself for not preventing the tragedy. It was Karen who supported Anna when she decided to open a roadside cafe for bikers, taxi drivers, and passing truckers. The next morning, Mark got up early and headed to Lewis, who had taken up residence in Karen's apartment. He parked his motorcycle by the entrance, carelessly tossed his helmet on the seat, and climbed the stairs. The apartment was on the third floor. The door was ajar, and Mark quietly pushed it open and entered. Everything looked like a battlefield: items, boxes, clothes, dishes scattered everywhere, and the table was littered with cigarette butts and empty bottles. In the corner sat Lewis in sweatpants with a dazed look, clearly not in a state one could call sober. "Well, look who's here," Lewis slurred, swaying in his chair. "Finally made it to me. Who are you, some kind of miracle pea? What are you doing here?" Mark asked, glancing around. "What do you think?" Lewis grinned slyly, waving an empty vodka bottle. "Taking what's rightfully mine." "This isn't your apartment," Mark said coldly. "It was Karen's inheritance from her father." "Is she your real sister?" Lewis laughed. "I'm still going to get what's mine." "You've got things mixed up, buddy." Mark took a step closer. "This apartment isn't yours. You have no claim to it. Got it?" "I'm not afraid of you," Lewis said, involuntarily stepping back from Mark's firm hand. "Then you should be," Mark said, looking Lewis straight in the eyes. "It's not wise to play with fire." Lewis pressed his lips together and tried to appear braver than he actually was. "You have no right to intimidate me. You're that cop who retired after getting injured, right?" "Don't push your luck," Mark smirked, feeling a sharp pain in his chest at that moment. "It's not going to end well for you." Lewis looked at Mark in confusion. "What are you talking about? Are you planning to use force?" "I don't think it will come to that," Mark said, straining to suppress the pain. "But you need to leave and not come back." "Are you out of your mind, ex-cop?" Lewis exclaimed, trying to hide his fear. "Don't think you can stop me. I haven't said my last word yet." "Well, I'll be waiting," the guest smiled. "Whenever you're ready." "Anytime." Lewis glared at him with hatred but stayed where he was. He knew he couldn't handle Mark right now. "Fine, I'll be back," he hissed and rushed out of the apartment. Mark was left alone. The pain in his chest intensified, making it hard for him to breathe. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. "I need to take a break," he muttered to himself, "and see a doctor." As he was leaving the building, he noticed Karen. Apparently, she had decided to come early to talk to Lewis, hoping to catch him sober and without his rowdy friends. She stood there, holding a purse and looking anxiously at the pale biker. Mark tried to smile at her, but it came out less convincing than he intended. "Don't worry, everything will be fine. He won't take your apartment." With that, Mark took a step towards her, but at that moment, the pain in his chest flared up again. The man staggered and gripped the wall tightly. "Are you okay?" Karen asked with concern in her voice. "Yeah, I'm fine," Mark said, trying to take a deep breath. "Just a little tightness, nothing serious. Gangster bullet acting up." "You need to see a doctor," Karen said, looking at him anxiously. "Don't worry about it," he replied, making an effort to smile. "I'll go to the doctor today." "All right," Karen acquiesced. "But you have to call me when you get home." "Sure," he nodded. "I'll call, but later in the evening. I still need to sort out the bracelet and the people who either wanted to adopt or steal Robert." Karen watched him leave and then quietly crossed his broad back. Despite the pain, Mark headed towards the nearest pawn shop. He needed to talk to people who dealt with items pawned by clients. His luck improved at the first place he visited. A woman named Liza worked there, and she didn't hide from him that the bracelet he described had been brought in recently. However, Liza had refused to take it, but she remembered the person who brought it in. He was wearing black jeans and a blue t-shirt, tall, handsome, with blue eyes. "He brought the bracelet 3 days ago," Liza said. "He said he didn't need it and wanted to get as much as possible for it, but we didn't have enough in the register. In the end, he left." Mark nodded, thanked her for the information, and hurried to the next pawn shop. His luck continued to improve. The bracelet was in the hands of the owner, who not only had bought it but also knew all the details about how it had come into their shop. And what was his name? What did he tell you? Where did he get the bracelet from? Mark asked, keeping his eyes fixed on the owner. The elderly man adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses on his nose and replied, "The bracelet was brought in by Lester Baldwin. His name is quite well known in certain circles, as you might imagine." "I understand, but the bracelet is stolen. So, I'd like you to hold on to it until the official investigation," Mark said with a smile, even momentarily forgetting the sharp pain in the left side of his chest. "Oh, well, tried to do the right thing, and it turned out like always," the appraiser muttered, placing a recount sign on the counter. Mark gave a knowing grunt. Once outside, he looked up at the sky and smiled. The day promised to be good. It seemed like 2 problems were solved, and the main issue was still ahead, regarding the mysterious foreigners who took little Robert from the orphanage. Gathering his resolve, the former police officer headed there. Deep down, he hoped the director would help him understand the situation. Mark, like many in the city, knew Jeffrey Mathis as a strict but fair man. However, in this case, justice might not be on Mark's side. It was not just about the director's tendency to assert his authority, but also about his awareness of the risks involved in revealing information. Jeffrey didn't beat around the bush and immediately gave a categorical refusal. "I can't tell you anything, Mark. With all due respect to your former profession, understand this: I'm not authorized to disclose personal information about the children without the consent of their guardians." "Guardians of Robert?" Mark repeated in surprise. "Of course," the director nodded, adjusting the suspenders on his shoulders, which were secured to his trousers with a sturdy clasp. "These are caring parents. They had been watching Robert for quite a while. Could you tell me a few details?" Mark asked insistently. "No, I can't tell you anything." "I'm not allowed," Jeffrey repeated. "And what if I tell you that I already know or suspect everything?" Mark smirked. "And what exactly do you know?" "Who told you?" The director became anxious. He sensed that Mark was a step ahead. "You can't say anything because you have no choice," Mark continued. "You're afraid. Afraid that the client will come after you." "I'm not afraid," the director said, though his voice trembled. "All right," Mark said. "Here's the deal. I won't tell the police that you know, but you have to tell me everything that really happened." The director took a deep breath and began to recount. The people from Roland Canton arrived at the beginning of summer. He's a foreign businessman who wanted to adopt Robert. They brought a lot of money with them. Well, for the assistance and help with the guardianship process. "How much?" Mark challenged. The director hesitated, then wrote the amount on a piece of paper. "Such a large sum?" Mark was surprised. "Yes. Roland said Robert had good genes. He also said the boy would be a good child." "And did you believe him?" Mark asked. "I didn't know what to think. I didn't want to place Robert with a foreign family. But on the other hand, Roland was offering a fortune. So, they took Robert, and recently Roland's people called me and said that Robert ran away on the way to the airport. He asked to use the restroom and took off." Mark remained silent, sensing in his heart that the director was not lying. He saw the fear and desperation in his eyes and understood Jeffrey was indeed afraid of Roland. Leaving the director's office, Mark realized it was time to seek help from his former colleagues. Otherwise, how would he find out why Roland needed an unknown boy named Robert? And what if the boy was not as simple as he seemed? Perhaps he himself didn't even know. Mark resolutely headed to the police station. His inner voice told him this was his last chance to uncover the truth. He was convinced that Roland Canton was not as straightforward as he appeared. The man's intense desire to adopt the boy and the fact that Robert ran away while being transported to the airport suggested that something more was at play. Mark recalled the fervor in the director's eyes when he spoke about how Roland was willing to pay a huge sum. Mark was greeted at the police station by his former partner, Alex Morris. In Alex's eyes, Mark saw the familiar confusion that always marked the beginning of their joint investigations. "Mark, what are you doing here?" Alex asked, clearly agitated. "I'll explain everything in a moment," Mark said, prepared for Alex to think he was losing his mind. "It's not what you think. I don't want any trouble, just need some help." A few minutes later, over coffee, Mark laid out everything to his former colleague. Alex started taking notes, and when Mark finished, he remained silent for a long time. "All right, Mark, I get it. Do you think this foreign guy, Roland, is threatening the boy?" "I'm not sure yet," Mark replied, "but something is definitely off. I can feel it." "Okay, let's take it step by step," Alex said. "I assume there won't be an official report?" "No, I'd like to keep this unofficial so as not to put Robert at risk." "Got it," Alex said. "I'll do everything I can, but you need to understand, this could be pretty dangerous." Alex began gathering information. He interviewed the orphanage director, found Roland's contacts, and checked out his business. Everything seemed clean. Roland was one of those people who knew how to cover his tracks. Mark called his friend daily to check on progress. He became increasingly convinced that Roland was secretly planning something sinister. The officers met Roland's business partners, but none of them knew why he suddenly wanted to adopt a child. "We should check Roland's unofficial contacts just in case," Alex suggested. "Maybe he's involved with someone from the criminal world." The police spent several days searching for leads. Alex and Mark became true detectives as they delved into the worlds of business, crime, and orphanages. They reviewed all documents. They were clean, no crimes were recorded. But an interesting detail surfaced in Roland's background. He had an enemy, Philip Lynch. Philip was a successful businessman in the oil industry and also lived abroad. Philip was Roland's competitor, and there had long been a feud between them. After some thought, the officers decided to meet with Philip. Not in person, of course, but via an online conference. Initially, the video call yielded no results. Philip turned out to be a rather reserved individual and was unwilling to discuss his feud with Roland. However, after some probing, Mark and Alex accidentally learned that Philip had a daughter named Marlene. With difficulty, the businessman admitted that Marlene had run away to her home country 9 years ago, got pregnant by some rogue, and died during childbirth. Philip had never known who his grandchild's father was. "I don't even know where he is now," Philip said. "I've never seen my grandson." "But Roland specifically wanted to adopt Robert," Mark said. "Why?" "The birth dates and Robert's age match." "Oh, I see now. Roland is my archenemy," Philip exclaimed. "That scoundrel must have wanted to use my grandson to make me more amenable. Good heavens, he's not a man but a devil incarnate." At that moment, Mark understood everything. The villain's plan was simple. But the businessman's schemes fell apart when Robert ran away on the way to the airport. By the end of the investigation, Mark decided to visit Karen at the cafe where she now worked for Anna. He arrived in the evening when the place was not very crowded. "Hi. How are you?" Mark asked. "Oh, hi. Everything's good. I came to see you. I wanted to tell you about the results of my investigations. I got in touch with my former colleagues, and they helped me with the bracelet and your brother Louis. Lester Baldwin has already been detained and is giving testimony regarding charges of fraud and theft, and Louis has gone to stay with relatives in the countryside to keep out of trouble." "Thank you, Mark. I'm so glad you're like this," Karen smiled. "It's no trouble. I'm always ready to help," Mark replied, noticing Robert coming outside to look at his motorcycle. "Hi, Robert," the biker called out. "Hi, Mark," the boy said. "Listen, buddy, I want to tell you a secret. Do you know that you have a grandfather?" "A grandfather?" Robert asked, surprised. "Where is he?" "He lives abroad, but I found him." "Abroad?" the boy said, intrigued. Yes, and he is very eager to meet you. What's his name? Philip Lynch, Mark answered with a smile. Philip? Robert repeated the name. Interesting. I'm sure he will be very happy to meet you. And what does he like? Robert asked. Mark smiled. Well, Philip seems to enjoy playing chess. And he's very kind and smart. Does Grandpa know that I like to draw? The boy continued. Yes, of course. I told him everything about you. And when will we meet him? The boy asked, with a hint of skepticism. Soon, I've already arranged everything. Great! Robert exclaimed. Mark smiled and looked warmly at Karen. Suddenly, he began to feel unwell, his head started spinning, and a throbbing pain set in. Karen noticed something was wrong and asked with concern. Are you okay? Yes, I'm fine, just a bit tired, he replied, trying to smile, but Karen could see something was off. Mark took a couple of unsteady steps and suddenly collapsed onto the pavement. Mark! Karen screamed, rushing to him. He tried to say something, but nothing came out. His head was spinning, darkness clouded his vision, and the world around him blurred like a fog. In a panic, Karen called for an ambulance. The emergency team arrived quickly, and Mark was taken away in an unconscious state. After examining the patient, the doctor said, He has acute chest pain, most likely due to a shard. We need to perform emergency surgery. Are you sure this will help? Karen asked, struggling to hold back tears. We will do everything possible to save him, the doctor replied. Karen sat by Mark's side, not taking her eyes off him and praying for his survival. Deep down, she couldn't imagine her life without him. He had become a cherished person to her, a friend, a protector. That day, Robert came to the hospital. The boy held himself like a true man, though his eyes showed worry. How's Mark? He asked softly. He's in surgery, Karen replied. Don't worry, he's going to recover, Robert said, trying to comfort her as he patted her hand. The surgery was indeed successful, but Mark remained in critical condition. He couldn't speak and only weakly nodded in response to the doctor's questions. Karen held his hand, her heart breaking with pain and anxiety. Later that day, Philip Lynch arrived at the clinic. He had flown in directly from abroad as soon as he received news of Mark's condition. Meanwhile, his rival Roland, along with his aides, had gone into hiding, fearing retribution for his attempt to adopt Philip's grandson. Mark, I'm so glad to see you. I heard about what happened to you. You're a strong man, you're going to recover. In the meantime, I will cover all the expenses for your treatment and rehabilitation, Philip assured him. Mark was surprised. He hadn't expected such help from the foreign businessman. Thank you. After being discharged, Mark, along with Karen, went to a resort for his necessary recovery. He was feeling better but wanted to make sure that his past injury would no longer haunt him in the future. 2 months passed, and they finally returned home. During their seaside vacation, Mark and Karen had decided to get married. Now that Mark was healthy, they felt it was time to officially solidify their relationship. Karen, I love you so much. Will you be my wife? Mark asked, taking his bride's hand. With a heartfelt yes, Karen felt truly happy. At their wedding, which was celebrated at Anna's Cafe, Scott Baldwin was among the guests. He had divorced his wife and had moved to a powered wheelchair. Life went on. A year later, the young couple welcomed a baby girl, whom they named Anna. Robert was thrilled when he saw the little one, often visiting her with the permission of his grandfather.